Assalamu alaikum. Today's podcast is going to be about the last 10 days, focusing on salvation, and it has to do with Ramadan as well as the month of Mental Health Awareness Month, which is in May. I'm trying to combine both at the same time. I wanted to look at a blog that I have written in the past, and the blog is titled Let Your Fear of God Be Embedded with Love. And a little bit more in detail in my book, God Intervenes Between a Person and Their Heart. I retitled that particular blog, if you will, Healthy Fear of God, How to Have a Healthy Fear of God. And the reason for this particular, if you will, essay or reflection point has to do with grappling with a loving God and then hellfire as well as punishment. And so if you can be patient with me as I try to share my thoughts and my ideas, if we consider humanity, we tend to have this human nature where we become deluded. And I'm not throwing arrows at any person, but at a human nature in general, we nurture hope. But what happens is, just given our own limitations and our own way of how we malfunction, is sometimes this can lead, if you will, to delusion if we also are not faced with the other reality, which is to be nurturing fear. So we enter Ramadan. If you notice, we are nurturing hope, we are nurturing love, we are nurturing mercy, we are nurturing forgiving, telling individuals God is forgiving, come limping, come crawling, come walking. And many speakers mention these realities, if you will. And we also talk about how God is most loving, how God is most merciful, how God overlooks all your sins if you turn to Him. But there comes a time when some individuals, if you will, take advantage of that, and we end the month of Ramadan by nurturing fear. So we're always, as a faith community, between, if you will, hope and fear. And there's a value and a wisdom in it, because as humans, and we all have probably experienced that, we spend a considerable amount of time, if you will, judging the salvation of others, judging the flaws and shortcomings of others, judging the piety of others, and we don't see our own faults or shortcomings. We see the good we do, we see all the mistakes and shortcomings of others. Now, if it just translates to you're having a bad opinion of others, well, I mean, it's sinful, but that's fine. But it can actually go into areas of where it leads to harm, physical harm, mental harm, emotional harm, spiritual harm. So it can actually transgress these boundaries, where when we're constantly obsessed with others, their faults and their mistakes, we end up going into the areas of where we start to rationalize and justify abuse and oppression. So I begin the blog by saying, "Oh God, I ask for your love, the love of those who love you, and the deeds which will cause me to attain your love." So this is from Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace and blessings. So this particular, if you will, understanding was meant to help us to understand not just love, but that genuine true love of God has to also recognize that He's not our personal God that we have wrapped around our finger, but He's the Lord of the universe. That means all the creations. He's the Lord of all of these creations, And just like we have rights and we have responsibilities, they also have rights and they have responsibilities, and we have to learn to coexist. So let me just begin the blog as I share it with you. So I said, how do we fear God? When some people think of fearing God, they imagine God as a fearsome torturer. This God is towering, vindictive being who's just waiting for them to make a mistake. In fact, it's the reverse. The God who we fear is patient and loving. This God gives us opportunity after opportunity to repent, to feel remorse, to change our habits, and to grow. Punishment comes into the picture only when it becomes evident to God and to everyone around that an individual is not receptive to grow. Indeed, God gives us many opportunities to see our actions through others' eyes. Pharaoh was such an archetype, so if I always focus on some archetype figures in the Quran, and he's one of them. He was surrounded not just by slaves who he dehumanized and oppressed, and this is what happens when you become deluded, where you don't have no fear of God. But he also had people of light and goodness in his home. And these is namely, for example, Asya, his wife, and her adopted son, Moses, upon him peace. Pharaoh also had a pious, wise advisor. He was a relative. There were others in his kingdom who tried to steer him toward a better way, to the intertwined love and fear of God, if you will. But none of these good people were able to have an impact on Pharaoh. His arrogance and narcissism were simply too deep-seated. So yes, God is loving, merciful, compassionate, and patient, yet this can't be all, because there also comes a time for justice. And so as we end Ramadan, we are now nurtured to be a just community, an accountable community, if you will, as well as humility. That we should be focusing also on our salvation, because human nature is we are very good at giving advice about and showing, if you will, a false concern for others' salvation, but we're not very good at receiving it. And so the focus these 10 days is on salvation of ourselves, our souls, and praying to God and begging God to save us from the hellfire. We shouldn't fear God because we believe that God is vindictive. God doesn't care only about a select elite. God is compassionate and cares about everyone. So instead, we fear God because God is majestic. This majesty should bring not our just quavering, but our humility. Should help us to authentically know our own limitations, if you will. So it is a positive force, if you will. The fear of God is indeed positive. It nudges us always to do right. It's this fear that compels us to get to know others in spite of our differences. This fear also presses us to be humble and not to transgress the boundaries of others. For instance, at times like when we see it right now and we're experiencing it in the United States, when marginalized groups express anger and rage, it hits our ears in a difficult way. Maybe the way in which people express their anger sounds harsh, and it's hard for us to hear. But the fear of God should force us to hear the pain and struggle of groups that are calling out. Indeed, the fear of God should humble us so that we can hear communities in pain. This is particularly true, of people who are being impacted by our transgressions, if you will, and our abuse, and we are becoming deluded and not aware. So the fear of God is a healthy fear. Just as our body sends us a message of pain when it's ill, telling us that we need to tend to it, the fear of God should send us a similar message when we are about to cause harm to others. Now, let me just take a moment and talk about our ability to disobey. Sometimes, and this is just human nature again, in the Quran, Satan is not an angel. I'm sorry, it's not sometimes. He is not an angel. Instead, he is from smokeless fire, belongs to a beings called jinn. And like humans, jinn have the ability to obey or disobey. So if you can think of Satan, Adam is like the father leader of human beings. Satan is the same for the jinn. And it is said that Satan was once an avid worshiper of God in the company of the angels. Then came along this newcomer, Adam, who wasn't made from fire like jinn, but from lowly clay. So Satan didn't want to know Adam. He felt that given all he'd done, God owed him something. The angels recognized that Adam was a special being. Satan was also invited to that journey to recognize the special aspects of Adam, but he rejected it. Satan felt that because he was made of fire, he was better than Adam. But the most important part of this journey that Satan went through was that he didn't have genuine love of God. Like here we began, like I said, Ramadan. We're turning to God for seeking forgiveness. We're turning to God, seeking mercy. We're turning to God, seeking salvation at the end, from the hellfire. But so Satan did not have love of God, but he didn't have fear of God. So he didn't have love or fear. He was not able to, when God put a mirror in front of him and showed him how Adam responded, he was not able to feel remorse. He was not able to seek forgiveness. He was not able to seek, if you will, mercy. But moreover, and this is the important thing, and I say it for myself first and foremost, that all people of faith have to take into consideration. He didn't have fear of God. He challenged God. He took a vow to bring down the children of Adam and his progeny. And he took also, he was determined that he was going to come at them from every direction to mislead them. So if you're working your whole life to guide people to God, like one speaker said that if you control part of taqwa or piety is controlling your emotions, but part of also taqwa or piety is not engaging in machinations and games, if you will, that causes confusion or manipulation or misguidance or harm, like gaslighting people so that they are totally confused. So that's also part of piety. So Adam comes with this confusion, if you will, and because it says his argument is weak, but he took a vow. And so here he is guiding people with the angels to God. And now when he doesn't get what he wants, and that's why he obligates God, and I keep stressing on obligation, it showed that particular trial and tribulation showed he had no love of God, which we nurture in ourselves in the beginning of Ramadan, I repeat again, and he had no fear of God because he now is at war. He's now trying to go mislead Adam and his progeny away from God. So he's an enemy, is what the way God refers to him. So Satan was very worshipful, but he had no fear of God. It was his lack of fear that made him violate the boundaries, not just of God, and I don't mean that God allowed him to, no one can hurt God or violate God, but in a sense that to speak with him by blaming God, like he comes with through accusation, because you put me in error, because you did this, because you did that. So he's now speaking to God through projection and blame. So in that way that he's violating how he even communicates with God. The rules, and you might say the ethics of communication. So Satan makes an oath to God that he'll spend the rest of his life trying to bring Adam down. Where he should have felt fear, Satan instead felt entitlement. So we seek protection from God that we should do that. Mindfulness and faith. So what lessons can we take from those two archetype figures, if you will, Pharaoh as well as Satan here I'm referring to? The outward show of faith, in the case of Satan, shouldn't bring us self-satisfaction and entitlement. So as we're coming out of Ramadan and we're reaching the end, we should nurture in us accountability and nurture in us humility. Any act that we do, we should be mindful and conscious of why we're doing it. These acts are, after all, not just for our singular selves. They are also for God and for everyone to whom we're connected. Indeed, when we act for God, we become aware of the boundaries of ourselves and others. A person can feel enlightened, but unless they're aware of the boundaries of others, that's not true self-knowledge. It's instead a sort of narcissism. Here I'm referring to both Satan and the Pharaoh. Because the Pharaoh did build great things, it wasn't, but that enlightenment that they assumed was enlightenment was a sort of narcissism because he wasn't aware of the boundaries of the people in his household or the boundaries of those who were under his power, meaning the Israelites. So it's uncommon for religious people to worship the command of God instead of God. But if we really feel God is king, then there should be a fear of being held accountable inside of us. It doesn't matter who we are, what faith, or of no faith at all, like Pharaoh claimed, like he was God. But we must feel an accountability for transgressing the boundaries of others. If we realize our actions aren't only for ourselves, we will be aware of that. So I end now with fear embedded in love. So we began the journey of nurturing love, nurturing hope, nurturing forgiveness, nurturing mercy, and now we're ending with nurturing fear. So the embedded part, if you will, again, we have to focus on that because it cannot be fear divorced from love. And love is abusive if it's also divorced from fear of God. So there isn't just a question of why we fear God, but how do we do it? We shouldn't fear God from a distance or while running away. We should have a fear of God that's deeply embedded in love. If you dislike and fear someone, then you most likely want to escape them, since we want to run away from people we hate. If we have a bad opinion of God, perhaps you imagine that God is just waiting to throw a thunderbolt and smack you for some ill deed. Then you'll most likely be running away from God. But instead, we must embed our fear in love. In this case, we run to God. To understand this, it helps to think of someone who you love very much. That person who you care about is displeased or angry at one of your actions, then you don't run away. Instead, your love for them forces you to care about their opinion, their knowledge. So it's our fear of displeasing this beloved that makes us attentive, that can help set us right. So we shouldn't fear God because we're just afraid of hell or punishment. And hell and punishment is real. Our relationship with God isn't one of an abused victim with an abuser. We would be afraid of displeasing a beloved, and this is something we can only do when we foster the relationship with God. And this is how Ramadan begins. Fostering a relationship, fostering the hope, fostering the love, fostering us to know God. But to help us understand the difference between fear-mongering and having a paranoia of God is not the same as fearing God. Those who truly fear God are those who know and love God. So, fear and anger is another part I would like to focus on. Fear of God should most certainly not be rooted in anger. At its worst, this creates a situation that is ripe for brainwashing. A person might be angry about a particular cause, for instance, and theirs might be a well-legitimate anger. But first, that person needs to nourish their self-knowledge and their connection and relationship with God. If the relationship with God is not built, then others can easily come along, validate their anger, and lead them astray. Certainly, this lack of self-knowledge isn't just a state that religious people can manipulate, and we've witnessed that in the elections with the recent elections. Anyone who is stuck in a situation of free-floating anger without a strong relationship to self and God might be ripe to follow a demagogic and destructive leader. Instead, we need to develop our relationship with God, our knowledge of ourselves, and to let ourselves be guided by a fear that is deeply, deeply embedded in love. So I hope you have benefited from this, and I hope you use the time the last 10 days wisely, and that you recognize the value, the importance, as well as the benefit from using those last days focusing on our salvation, our own salvation, and asking God to protect us from being thrown in the hellfire, and that we come out of Ramadan with a faith that, unlike Satan, is embedded in that is between faith, that is between love, hope, and, if you will, fear, so that we can be mindful in faith and we can continue our journey. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you.